Cool. So yeah, today we're going to talk about more like web scraping, which is what section 18, I believe, is what we're getting into. So web scraping, like I said, is kind of like if you have an API, awesome. If you have a database, awesome. If you have it in some format like a CSV file, something you can kind of like pull in, read in from, awesome. But if you don't have those things, which usually a lot of the time, you have to do some scraping. And that's kind of like you're trying to find in the website, usually a website, trying to find this data and trying to extract the meaningful information from it. So I have my, sorry, I have a little thing we go through. And so the first thing we need to know for web scraping is basically what web pages look like. So that's why we'll actually be talking about HTML and what's it called, CSS. And before we can even do any of the web scraping, because we have to know how the website's formatted before we can, process any of this data. And so let's see here. Today, I don't have it actually uploaded to, oops, I don't know how I did that. Sorry, guys, I formatted my screen in a weird way. But I don't have a collab notebook today, but I do have it saved as of right now in this resources GitHub. So I'm trying to keep things up in here so you guys can access it. So I'll send this out right now. APIs, no, we are web scraping. Okay. Yeah, so I'll send this out to you guys right now, but just know it's pretty much exactly what we see right here. And so the first thing we need to know is basically how websites are structured and everything like that. So like I said, the format of like the order preference, and everyone has a slight difference, but this tends to be close to what data scientists will want. It's basically some direct access to formatted data, whether that's like kind of a database that you have internally. You don't have to go query it outside, in the cloud or something like that. Your CSV, it's all packaged in there. It's all ready. It's all set for you to read into your data frame or whatever you're going to use to process it. Then usually API is kind of like the gold standard after that. Being like, if you can send a request and have the server basically process that information, you don't care how it is. You just like, all right, give me this information, server process it and gives you that part back. That makes it a lot easier. And then the last part really is scraping the data. When you scrape that data, you can hear like all the terms use it, scrape or not scrub, but like we scrape the data, we clean the data, we scrub the data. It's like you can hear it's like it's just dirty. It takes work, and that's kind of like our viewpoint a lot. But it's really useful to have. And then of course other sources, like I said, a survey. But of course we don't really think of those too often, just because we can't do those at scale. Okay, so the web is really built on top of like HTML. Okay, so hypertext markup language. That's what it stands for. Hypertext basically it means that it's text, but with some extra stuff. Markup, basically, it's just saying what it looks like. So if you ever looked at an HTML web page, so I'm just going to pull this up and do an inspect element. And you can see the stuff on the right here. All this junk right here, this is all our HTML. And it's actually formatted really nice for us to read here. But you can see, as we talked about from before, there's the different parts of HTML and everything. And you can see this is all web pages. All web pages, when we ever go on the internet and you see with your browser, basically most, if not well, not everything, but most things that you see online are just HTML files. And so the markup language, basically, instead of building like it built in like, a picture, for example, a picture is a picture, like you can see exactly what it is. Markup languages basically say, hey, this thing right here, I want you to do this with it. Or this thing right here, this is, for example, a paragraph. And basically your browser is the thing that takes that file, looks at it, and says, all right, this is how I'll render it. So that's why sometimes different browsers will render things differently and stuff like that. So that's kind of what's going on when we talk about it as a markup language, right? Again, like I said, pretty much all the web is built on top of HTML. Obviously, this isn't 100% true. But all the stuff that you think of, like, go to google.com, if you go to a web page, if you go to anywhere, pretty much it is some form of HTML, okay? And you can really look at it. It's really just like XML. Like really HTML is XML. It's a markup language. It's just a specialized XML that browsers know how to render and stuff like that. So we've seen XML before. So HTML is really not that different. It's just specific to how it looks on a browser. Okay. Now, everything's built into something called tags, right? And so these tags are basically these triangular brackets right here. So it's brackets. And basically, you usually will have a beginning tag and an ending tag. And so note that this is just similar to XML, as we have this opening tag, which is just in this case P, which is a paragraph. And you'll see that it has the character in here. It could be multiple characters. And then we have a closing tag, which has that backslash, right? Or forward slash. I always forget which direction it is. Forward slash for the paragraph right here. And that basically says it closes the tag. So it says, all right, start the paragraph here, and then everything in here is a paragraph. Now, what that paragraph means depends on the browser, depending on other factors too. These are basically a way, it doesn't actually do anything. It's just saying, hey, this is a paragraph, and the browser or whatever's rendering it has to decide what that's supposed to mean when we actually look at it. In a paragraph form, usually that means just like it's blocked together and you can have multiple lines. Let's see if I was thinking. Note that you can put tags within themselves. So for example, I have this paragraph right here. So I can actually show you guys what this looks like, because Jupyter Notebook uses HTML natively. We actually use Markdown, which is like a shortcut for HTML. But if I do a paragraph here, I can do like, hello, what is your name? Hi there. And I'm just making stuff up. And note that HTML, when it renders, usually doesn't care about white space. So you'll see right here, I get this kind of specialized formatting right here. This actually normally wouldn't happen. I think it's probably because I have it this paragraph. But you can see here, it ignored pretty much all of that extra spacing except for that new line. So this is kind of like what you'll start seeing the web and you'll start thinking, oh, that's probably a paragraph, okay? And you can have multiple paragraphs and you can see that tag has disappeared, but that is what's rendered over here. We can also have, like I said, tags within tags. So I can have another paragraph within another paragraph. And what's interesting about HTML is that there isn't necessarily, well, people can do whatever they want kind of. And so you'll notice like this, for example, this messed up. And sometimes you'll see if someone doesn't write a website well or they messed up in some way, you'll see weird junk like this and it'll look different on different browsers. That's the kind of stuff you have to worry about when we're doing web scraping, but just to kind of look ahead. But usually you'll see a tag, and the reason why you see that part, if you're curious, right? So why, for example, let me ask you guys, why do we see this end tag, do you think, is coming up? Probably because it's ending it over here, right? And so it's getting confused, where does it end? Is it ending this one first, or is it ending this one first? And HTML basically goes, like most parts when it gets rendered, goes top, bottom. So it's going paragraph, paragraph, and ends this part, but then doesn't know when to end the next one. So for example, if I put something like another tag, which is H1, which is a heading, we'll talk about all of these in a second. You can see I can have this tag within the tag. And I think this is actually coming in because Jupyter's rendering it differently. So you can see I have a paragraph inside there as a tag. Normally you wouldn't have this specific case, but you can do kind of those things. And HTML tries to figure it out. It tries its best to know what to do, basically. Okay, that's a tag. All right. Next part basically comes into the attributes. So this is kind of like what we can do like to decorate our tags. So you'll notice, like, for example, this A, which is actually a link tag, a hyperlink tag, we can actually put attributes. In fact, for hyperlinks, it's not really useful unless you have this attribute called href, basically as a reference to where it'll click on. So when I have this tag right here for a link, click here for Google, what it'll be is that this will get displayed. This is what's inside the tag. And the attribute for href, it'll say what will allow you to be it. When you click on it, it'll take you somewhere. So you can see here that when I render this, you can see that I actually wrote this tag right here, literally the same thing. And you can see the reference is google.com. So I do this, and I actually were to click it, you'll see it takes to, well, in this case, it's going to Jupyter. If you look at this URL right here, it's actually going to Jupyter, basically my path on my computer, and then going to google.com. So if I actually change this now to actually do HTTPS, now they'll actually take me to an actual website. Okay. So things that you'll kind of notice and stuff like that is these are things that you'll see, what's it called? you'll see these things inside HTML as you're scraping through. So note that this can reference either another web page, like I just showed with https google.com, or like I saw with my slight mistake, is that without that, it actually tries to reference an actual file. It'll look for that file in particular. So just kind of know that's what's happening here. And honestly, you can go through like HTML references and see all the different kinds. But I'm just kind of briefly going through some of the things that look like. But main thing you should know is that you can put attributes within here. Note I can also make up an attribute here. Let's say you're like, oops, let's do it down here since it's an actual tag. This is not a real tag. This is not a real attribute, right? And you'll notice that nothing happens. That basically HTML is kind of forgivable. It says, all right, if I don't know what it is, I'm just going to ignore it. That's kind of what most browsers do. No, that's not always true though, too. But for the most part, we don't really care what browsers do. We really care about what data comes through. So just know sometimes people will mess up when they're making websites. A web developer didn't quite do the right thing, or maybe there's some bug in it kind of deal. You might get some of those kind of data and some interesting effects. Okay. All right. And then the last part really for HTML syntax is their comments. You'll see that basically it's a comment will start with, a bracket with this exclamation point and then dash dash. Actually, I wonder if I can't remember now if it's dash dash. I think it's 2 dashes, yeah. Dash dash, and then it'll end with, that's kind of confusing, but like it'll end with a dash dash bracket. So that's saying specifically a comment. So those things are the browser won't render. It's still in there. Like you'll actually notice if I look back on when we did inspect, where did I inspect it? Right here. Let's see if there's any comments. I don't think there's any comments in here. But if there were comments in here, they would not be rendered. You wouldn't see them over here at all, but they'd still be in the code, the HTML document. Okay. So you can see you can do multiple line comments like this. So these are things that you can come across. Okay. So that's the basic structure of the syntax. It's like there's tags, there's attributes, and there's comments. There's really nothing else. There's a whole bunch of different tags and a whole bunch of different attributes for each of those tags, but those are the only things you'll come across. Again, it's just XML. Right, any questions on this, guys? Cool, pretty straightforward. Who's actually seen HTML before, by chance? Okay, yeah, so cool. If you've done any web development or you kind of played around with JavaScript, you probably might have seen HTML. But if you haven't, you'll see a bunch of it now. Okay, so this kind of goes into our HTML document structure of how websites are built. And so our HTML basically is built on something called the DOM, right? The DOM structure, the document structure. And basically, one thing you should note is that for HTML5, to declare that's HTML5, we do a doc type HTML. Note that the reason why they do this partly is because of not backwards compatible, but for future compatibility. So in the future, if some other standard is used, they'll know that this is using an HTML5 standard, which might be like 20 years old at this point, but at least then it's be able to be used and everything. Okay. The main structure of the DOM is basically we have an HTML saying it's beginning HTML. This ends the document. And note that the spaces are extra. It just helps make it look like easy to read. And then we have our head right here, which usually is about metadata. You'll have like scripts. You have like what we'll learn about CSS and decoration, stuff like that at the very beginning. And then underneath here is your body, which is basically where most of the stuff you see. So these are the things that like if you go to a website, that's what you're seeing is the stuff in the body. So the main structure here is head and body. Sorry guys, my dog's really wanting to get out. Let me let him out real quick. Like that happened last time too when I had to let the dog out. So sorry, but she was whining like crazy. Couldn't handle it. Okay, but like I was saying, your DOM is basically structured your head, your body, and then inside there is your HTML. This is what I'm talking about. These are just tags, and then they're tags within tags. In this case, there's a head tag and a body tag within HTML. Okay, not too bad, right? Okay, so this kind of comes up to our different HTML elements, right? So these are all the things you can usually put in the body and everything like that, right? So, oops. So for example, there's paragraphs, which I just showed you, basically kind of like think of like you making a paragraph. There's headers. Note that there are different kinds of headers. You can have H1, H2, H3, and those usually will correspond to bigger, what's it called? Like bolder and bigger. but that's not necessarily true. Remember, it's a markup language, so it's not talking about what it should look like. It's just saying this is a header. So like usually you say, oh, a header 1 is the most important information, and a header 2, it's like these are like like what's it called, like subheaders. So for example, in Markdown, the equivalent is 2 hashtags like this, 2 octothorpes on here that says H2. If I had just 1, that's an H1. And then H2, H3, H4, H5. I don't know. I think H5 is the lowest it goes. I think technically you can do it lower, but I think the standard is only up to 5. So usually you don't see more than 3. 3 is usually the smallest one, unless some developer got really excited and started doing like H4s and stuff like that. And then we have our images. So images are pretty important too, especially for web scraping. If you want to find all the images, note that the images are structured a little differently, and depending on who wrote it, they might have written it differently. So for example, it starts with ing, which is your image, and then your SR source, right? So SRC, which is your source, that's the path to the image. And that could either be, like I showed with the href from earlier, that can either be a website, like something on the web. So it'll be like HTTPS, blah, 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 image.png or something like that. Or it could just be a path that's locally within that, within that website. So for example, if I'm on google.com and there's just a path that just says path to image, just like literally it says this, .png, that means if I actually were to go to, let's say it's on google.com, if I were to go to google.com/this, I would actually go to that image. But just note that it will be abbreviated like this. Sometimes you'll even see this // And does anyone have an idea what that // is trying to represent?
Just in whatever the folder is that you're in.
Yeah, you're close. It's actually the folder above it. So it's like saying the folder above it, go into that folder, and then go to path image. So you'll see sometimes like complicated stuff where you're like .. And then it'll be something like folder, something like that. Like, just know that you'll see those kind of things, and just know that basically is saying, oh, for example, if you're going on a website, it's going to, like, if you're on google.com as the main domain, google.com/these things to the folder. So I'm just kind of showing you what things you might see as you're scraping through data and what those parts actually mean. And then we have this alt here, and alt's actually really useful. It's not technically like again, none of this stuff is required. You can kind of like make HTML and just see what happens, and the browser will try its best. But alt has particularly been used for accessibility. So for example, if you're blind and you have accessibility programs to help basically describe what the program is, or if the program did, let's say the image didn't load, alt basically gives an alternative to like what that image is. So sometimes you'll see things like alt actually be used to describe the image. Also though, sometimes people use alt to just do random stuff. For example, XKCD has a famous alt. I'll show you real quick. And I think I showed you guys XKCD before. But XKCD, if you scroll over on top of the image, you'll actually see this. I like to think that somewhere out there, there's someone there, like just alt text. And I actually do an inspect element. You'll actually see here is, I can't see it well because something's blocking my thing. You can see here is the image, the source, and you can see there's that / images .xkcd comics text entry.png, and there's a title, and then there's alt, which is text entry. And then in this case, it looks like he actually has an entry for here. But basically this alt right here, oh, he's changed it. That's actually really good. He used to just put alt and like not have the rest of the text, but you can see that this is describing the image and stuff like that. So be aware of like, even though there's standards and for the web standards, not everyone follows it. So something to be aware of as you're scraping through. And that's kind of true for pretty much everything you're gonna scrape. It's like, oh, it should be this, but maybe it's not. And that's something you're gonna have to figure out sometimes. Next we have is list, unordered and ordered list. And so an unordered list, you basically started off as UL. And then within that UL, you have list item, list item, list item. And what this will look like, if I actually take this part and I try to render it over here, you actually see it makes little dots right here. And sometimes, depending on what the website looks like, do asterisk or something fancy. Note that you could also have something like an unordered list within an unordered list. So for example, I had a list item and I had like unordered list, and let's just say, it's a pain to write all these things. That's like the first element. You'll see there's a sublist. Oh, you get the point. You can have a list within a list, basically. So kind of be aware of like things that you can that can show up. And usually, actually, I just realized it's probably because it's OL. Oops. So you can see here is that I have one within there. And I think this partly is because I don't have extra elements, but you can have lists within lists. So you might see things like that. But an unordered list basically is just bullet points. An ordered list is numbered. You guys have probably seen, oh, see, this is the problem. Jupyter Notebook's trying to be too smart. You can see here, this automatically numbers them. So that's what, like, again, this is just how you can think of things. Usually you would use an ordered list when it's like something that comes in order. Again, though, depends on the programmer, depends on the developer, if they actually did that or follow the standards or not. Okay. So these are the most common ones that you'll see a lot of. There's other ones you can find. There's a whole list of HTML elements that you can find. Any questions on any of these things I just showed? Okay, cool. Thumbs up. Cool. All right. Awesome. Biggest one probably is image, because you'll probably a lot of times want to find images and scrape those images from a website so you can do something with it. So just know that kind of like this is how you can get it. And then you'll find other attributes too. For example, like you might find attributes to change width and size and style and stuff like that. So just know those are things that can exist. And then I saved tables as last. So you will see tables, but I kept this last because tables usually, if there's a table, usually there's data and information that you want to know about, since we're scraping for data. And so note that a table, the way it's structured in HTML is you have your table, and then basically this TR, I'm sorry, that's TR. Yeah, TR is basically like the row. And then this TH here, you'll notice that it's the only times that show up here, it's the headers. So you can see that basically like the name of the columns, and that's what's getting rendered right here. So header 0, header 1, header 2. These are like the names of the columns. And then we can have in each of the rows after that, so this is the next row after that, we can actually have data items. So TD is basically standing for table data. So this is a table data within that row. So, oops. So that TD right here, data item 0, first column, second column, third column, data item 1, first column, second column, third column. This can go through. Note that you can do, like, you might, even though this table's nice, looks very similar to a data frame, right? That's kind of like what a data frame really is, kind of like a table. Note that you might have some special things. So for example, you might see something like, I'll show a good example. Oops. You might have a developer write this guy right here. Oops, I guess I have to go right here, sorry. And then let's see, header 2. And what this does, basically, it spans multiple columns. So this is not an example because I only put one in there. So let's get this one. There we go. And you can see, for example, it's actually spanning multiple columns. So you might have things like that. You can also have something very similar with you have multiple rows are spanning. So for example, if I take something like this. Oh, sorry, I just realized this is the wrong one anyway, but this should actually be so anyway, what I was trying to show is that you can have multiple spanning. So you can get some weird, complicated stuff like this, like where, oh, this one's like, you know, for example, I was looking at, when I was looking to scrape some data about the Olympics on a website, they had like, you know, everyone who's in bronze or like in a country, it's like, oh, everyone from Sweden is in this block. But then in that block, there would be like multiple rows talking about each person in the country. And so you'll see data kind of formatted this way. So note that you might have to kind of like look at how it looks like. When I say look, like look at the data and see like, oh, it's spanning multiple columns and all this stuff. And you kind of have to finesse exactly what you're looking at. So, but something good to check out and everything to make sure you understand it. Okay. But anyway, tables are really important. You can kind of look more into it. In fact, I think I have one right here. Not everyone likes using w3schools.com. It's not always the most complete, but they give a pretty good example of like all these different table stuff. And you can see like they're really explaining it to like say, oh, this is how you build a website. But most of the time we're looking more like saying, hey, how can we scrape that website? How is it built? And what can we get? What useful information can we get? So you can see, for example, column span and all that stuff. Okay, cool. Any questions again on tables? Went through really quickly. Just know that that's probably, if you're looking for data, usually data will be in tables in some way. Not all the time. Sometimes you're looking for text, sometimes you're looking for images, but sometimes websites, all their data is within a table. So that's what you'll kind of go to. Okay, cool. And then I put a little note on here for HTML5. HTML5, note that basically there's a tag called div, and you can think of like div as like a generic container. So you can, usually you'll see divs, for example, I think if we go to what I have here, you'll see lots of div. Basically, those are like generic containers. Excuse me. Generic containers. HTML5 has made more specific terms, and there's a lot of them. These aren't all of them. There's a lot more, but you can think of like a header, for example. It's like, oh, I want to talk about a header. You know, if I want a nav, your nav bar. It used to be using mostly divs, but now you can use a nav bar and use that tag to specify this is for navigation. Same thing for footer. You can now have a footer within the body. And then these are usually like main, aside, article, section. Those tend to be much more like when people write articles and like more news stories and stuff like that, people will write it along those lines and will use those kind of tags. Again, not everyone uses these tags and not everyone uses them in the way they are intended to be used. So just kind of be aware that there's not like a hard, fast rule that like, oh, well, this website can't exist. You know, if we use a section tag for the nav bar, it's like, well, that could be if someone was really bad at developing, they could have done that. So just know it's possible. And then canvas, I kind of threw that in there just because it's an HTML5 thing. That's like for drawing stuff and everything. But again, you should probably won't scrape through that. But anyway, there's a lot of HTML5 tags. There's a lot more tags now. It used to be relatively simple in the sense that there's not that many different elements you could use. Now there's a lot more, and not everyone uses them correctly. Just be aware. So yeah, that kind of brings us all of HTML, HTML5. Basically, they're all tag elements, and you can add attributes in them. This brings us to CSS, and CSS is really like the way it makes sites pretty. So for the most part, depending on what you're doing for data, right, you probably focusing mostly on the HTML tag, but sometimes the CSS is important. For example, maybe you want certain things that are sized a certain way, or you might notice that they structure their data or whatever you're interested in a very particular way, and you can use the CSS to understand or basically find those elements. So just know that our CSS, you take a tag, and basically you can specify, you can select what they're called selectors. You can select which element to change. So you can kind of think of CSS like changing different colors, changing different shapes, changing, there's even CSS3 where you can even change like transformations and stuff like that and do like weird kind of funky stuff and animations. That's what CSS does. But you basically use it to select. So you can select it by an element saying, okay, get all the paragraphs, get all, the header twos, get all the hyperlinks, okay? Or you can do it by something called class. And when I say class, it's not the same class that we talked about in object-oriented programming. Class is basically an attribute within there. So you'll look something like P, but it'll be class equals, I don't know, something like, robot text. And it's saying, oh, this should be robot text. And I don't know what robot text is, but you can define it in CSS and say, oh, anything with the class robot text should look like this. Oops. So like, that's what I'm talking about with the class. And then similarly, we'll talk about is ID. So you might have something like ID is equal to like main robot or something like that. These are the kind of things that you'll see in your HTML when you scrape it. you can see here, this is what it would look like in its actual HTML. With CSS, they'll do a grab like a dot name of the class. So this would be dot robot text. For ID, it's basically an octothorpe name of ID, right? Main robot, okay? So this is kind of the two things that you can select. Basically, CSS will use to select. Also know that for class, you can actually have multiple ones. So if you have robot text and say, you know, friend, okay? So you can have multiple classes. In this case, it has a class robot text, a class friend. You could even, I think CSS or HTML lets you do like class like this even, where you can have multiple classes, class, and then class again. But it'll be counted as multiple classes as you go through. So just kind of know that exists. And then you can also do it by value of an attribute, basically saying, hey, you know, I don't care about class, I don't care about ID, but like I want something specifically that has the attribute, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something useful, like width equals 50, like 50 pixels, get everything that's width equals 50 pixels. And you can say grab that specific attribute. And then also relative position of other elements, basically an element within an element. So like if it's like, oh, a paragraph that's within a div, you can get the div, all divs, and then get the paragraph that are within divs. And those are the ways you can those are the different ways you select in CSS. And so in the CSS, basically this is what it'll look like in its file. To be honest, I'm not gonna focus too much on this right now because there's, in the curriculum, they'll go through more details, but for the most part, we're not usually scraping along the CSS. You can, but it's not something that for data science we tend to do, just because that's not usually where all the interesting information lies. All the information usually lies in the HTML itself. But you should be aware that what CSS is and what it does, so you can grab things that basically you can look at a web page and you say, oh, I can see how this is formatted. And then you can say, okay, what do I need to do to create my program to scrape this website? Okay, cool. Any questions at all for structure of HTML, CSS, what it does, anything like that? All right, thumbs up if you're feeling pretty good about it so far. Cool. All right, yeah, and again, curriculum goes through a lot more details. So as we go through this, you know, just read that through, and I think that gives a pretty good amount of what you need to know. You can always look up more. There's so many resources about web development itself. But if you're interested about doing web development stuff, that's not what we're going to talk about. Obviously, we're going to talk about how to get all that stuff. And so that's what we call web scraping. So when we do web scraping, there's a few tools we can use. We'll talk about one of them today. But know that we're basically going off of the DOM, right? The document object model. Basically, the DOM is kind of like the structure of the document. And you can kind of think of it like saying, oh, we start off the head, you know, or like say we start off with the HTML, and we have the head. We also have the body. And then within that body, we have multiple elements. So you can kind of think of it more of a tree, basically. And kind of like you're able to go down this tree. And that's kind of what we saw with XML, right? And JSON. It's structured in that same way where we have tree of, like basically a tree of elements kind of going into it. And that's really what the DOM really is. And so you'll see DOM and you'll see DOM reference, but basically just know that it just means the document. It means like the structure of the HTML document, okay? And like I said, we can think of siblings, children, descendants, parents. Sometimes we'll call it leaf and nodes. They're all the same idea. Basically, you have a parent, and then underneath that are descendants, or it's children, and then you can go down to there, go deeper, or we can go up, travel up here, go to its sibling, and so on. So there's ways you can kind of navigate through the DOM, okay? But again, I'm not going to go into super huge detail because I think that's something you can pretty much figure out. And again, there's a good picture on the Learn curriculum that kind of shows you how you can think of it as a tree, all right? So there's a few tools we can use. One is Beautiful Soup. There's also Scrapy or Scrappy. I don't actually know which one. It's SCRAPY. Both references, both Beautiful Soup and Scrapy are in, what's it called? Are in the curriculum referenced. Mostly I'll be using Beautiful Soup. Beautiful Soup for me is more natural. There are some really nice reasons why you want to use Beautiful Soup. First of all, it's relatively fast. It basically it's an XML parser, and uses a good XML parser to go relatively quickly. So it's able to go through big HTML documents and pretty quickly and actually able to get all the information. Then it basically converts it into like this natural like way of navigating through Python. So like if you're used to basically having like dictionaries or lists and stuff like that, that's kind of like what it builds it like, which makes it really easy to like read if you're used to Python, which is what hopefully we all are now. We're kind of pretty used to Python. So it makes it nice and easy to go through it. And then what's another thing is too, is like we almost don't even think about because it's so nice, is that it does encodings. So encodings basically are saying how the website's formatted. So for example, if you're like UTF-8, basically you can talk about like how, like what are valid characters in here. If there's a different language, for example, like if you go into another country, they might have a different encoding to say, well, these characters should be interpreted this way. What's kind of nice is that we don't really have to think about that. You know, you might have to manually do it, but for the most part, Beautiful Soup kind of takes care of a lot of that stuff. So we don't even have to think about like, he's like, oh, like what kind of encoding is this? Oh, I have to make sure I specify this part. You're like, nope, I just go ahead and run through, and you probably don't run into an issue for the majority of times that you run Beautiful Soup. So again, nice advantage to that. Okay. All right. So you'll see here is that this is how you import Beautiful Soup. So BS4 is the actual package. Beautiful Soup is the thing that we're actually going to import. Okay. And usually you'll see people like, for example, I might do like as BS or something like that, or, you know, they'll put in something to refer because Beautiful Soup's kind of long. The good thing is that we'll usually use Beautiful Soup like this call like once, like when we're actually getting the document to create soup, which basically like they call it soup. Basically it's the DOM object in like Pythonic form. But so you will see some people not even bother with it because you're not calling it that often. But sometimes you'll see like me and other people name other things. Usually I'll call it like as BS just because it's easy to type that way. And then requests, we've seen requests before, right? Where we'll actually, you know, basically use that to get web pages. So we do a request to get that web page, and that way we can feed the document into Beautiful Soup, make our soup, and then process through that soup. Okay. And then I don't think we've seen RE, regular expressions. Have we seen this yet before, guys? I'm looking kind of blanks there, so probably not. So regular expressions, this is a really useful thing, to be honest. I am not as good at regular expressions as I'd like to be. It's really powerful to allow you to basically process through text formats and basically look for certain patterns within text. It's a really powerful tool, and what's really nice is that almost every searching function in some way can use regular expressions, which makes it, again, super powerful. If you wanted a date format, for example, where you know it's like a month, you know, some number, comma, a year, you can specify that format in regular expressions and basically search for that specific expression. So this is really useful for web scraping, obviously, because if you're looking for a very specific format within a text, you can do that quite easily. And I think the curriculum actually uses this a few times. So that's why I have it on here, just to kind of talk about what it is. But RE, again, just regular expressions. Okay, so this kind of shows you some important stuff. And let's actually see what happens now, right? So I have a quick thing right here, just getting the page. So I define this function. This is a very simple function, but sometimes you'll actually create functions, especially if you're scraping. And when you're scraping, usually that's not like one page. You're thinking about like, oh, let me get all the pages on this website. And so usually you'll write functions. That way you can just call a function rather than do this long mess of stuff. So kind of know that that's kind of the standard, and it's really useful because then you don't have to remember all of the things that you did, or like not remember all the things you did. You don't have to make these big old for loops with big, you know, huge things. You're just doing the same process over and over and over and over again. You might as well just write it in one big function. Okay. So in this case, it's just really simple, but basically get soup, which you can see, get the idea. We're going to get soup. We have our URL. That's going to be actually our web page. I'll use request.getURL. So this will actually be like, you know, in this case, I use Android Police. I just copied a random website that I go to. And I just do a .get, right? So I get this part. We've seen this before. This will get us the web page itself. In this case, I'm returning both the web page so we can check it out and Beautiful Soup, right? So you can see this actually creating the soup. So this, again, is the package itself, or actually the library, that function. And then we're going to do the web page.content. So we're getting the content of the web page, basically just essentially a string format of whatever the web page was. And then we're going to parse it through. I'm specifying the HTML parser. So saying, hey, this is HTML. Get ready to parse it through. Basically, get ready to look at this HTML and give me some soup. Okay, so this will actually be the soup itself. And have you guys seen this return before? I realize sometimes I do certain things that you guys might not have seen. So again, so this is just a tuple, in case you're curious. I could have put like parentheses around it like that, but I usually don't, and a lot of people don't, just because it's implied basically. You don't have to put these parentheses around it when you do a return like this, but those would be equivalent. Okay, so I run this guy right here, and then now I can actually get this certain soup. So page.soup, or page in soup. So I'm getting the page right here, the soup right here. If I had just done like all like this, so all, that would get me the tuple of these two things. But since I know it's a tuple and I want those two things separately, I'm just going to go ahead and put in page, soup. Okay, so I'm sure you've seen this a few times, but I just want to remind you guys, since sometimes it looks kind of funky. Okay, so I got, oops, I didn't import this, guys. Okay, now I got my soup, right? So first things first, if you guys remember, we can do like page.content, just to kind of show you what that looks like. And you can see, whew, look at that huge string, right? A huge mess. That's not just front page of the Android police. And you can see really big, really messy. I don't want to deal with that, right? So this is where soup comes in. So now we can do something called soup.prettify, which I'll show you what the soup looks like itself. And you can see, ooh, all right. And you can see, okay, looks kind of cool. Like you can see now it's a little more format and stuff like that. Okay, I think prettify actually in this case will do the same thing, but you can kind of see exactly what's going on. So this basically just puts it all together into one string. Okay, depending how you print it out, just depends what it is. Usually we won't really do anything too fancy with this. Okay, but I just wanted to show you what this looks like. So now you can kind of see when we look at this, I'll just do soup so it's easier to read. If I did my soup, you can see that HTML tag, so they're using HTML5. You can see they have their HTML, their head, right? So this is their metadata and all that stuff. You can see when we finish into head, there's their title, Android Police. We can keep going through. And you can see probably pretty far in their head. So they have a lot of extra stuff. Once you go past head, this is probably more in the body now. I probably passed by it at some point. Oh, there it is. There's body. So you can see here, they have that class, home, and then blog. So they actually have two classes here. You can see an ID. An ID can only be used once, by the way. I didn't mention that, but ID is called ID because it only allows you to do one thing can be called this ID. Only one can be called tip US. There can be multiple home and blog sections. You can see I have some divs here, containers, and these are divs within divs. So you can see it kind of goes pretty far in there. So you can see the general structure. So let's say it's like, okay, I want to find all the images, right? So in this case, I can say, all right, my soup, which is our beautiful soup, and I say dot find all, this tag, image, right? And so you can see, cool, that was pretty quick. And we can see, well, how many images are there? And images, okay, 75 images, all right, not bad. So we can actually check out some of the images. So let's say images 0. And we can actually see right here, this is our first thing, and we can, let's see, this is the source of the image itself, which I think in this case, oh, this is a source set right here. So you can see like there's different images. I can see each one of those parts. I can look at those parts and actually check it out. Like, okay, let me check out that image. And you can actually scrape that specific part, basically your source to the image, okay? Similarly, we can find all the divs, so all these sections in here. So I did find all div. You can see there's 480 divs. Just gotta get a preview of like all those different divs. We can do, you know, just a subset, and you can see it's just a list, right? So you see, okay, here's the first one, second one, third one, going through. And you can see this div right here actually has extra elements in here. It actually has, what's it called? A hyperlink. And it looks like, oh, that's just basically, what is this right here? Sorry, I got distracted. It's an emphasis. There's nothing in here. So this is actually an emphasis tag, but there's nothing actually in here. And then there's also H2, which is a heading. So you can see that this stuff actually has some info in there. So sometimes you actually want to say, hey, I want to find what's in there, right? So you can see here, I'll grab the fourth div and I'll say find the next siblings, and you can actually see the next one next to that div. You can see this part right here. So you can see, you can start grabbing these different parts of the HTML. And you can see here, I have another one where basically I do a find, I find the div with this class container, right? So this will find just the first one, the very first one will find where their class is a container. And if we run this now, we can actually see that right here. We got the container, and then these are all the stuff within that div right here. And you can see those ending tags. But this is the actual div itself. So I can actually start processing through, going deeper and deeper into it. If I wanted to, I could find all of them. So let's just call it, I'm just naming something real quick, D. Let's do the very first one. And you can see that's that same one right there. Oops, that's the same one right there. So you can see D right here is the same thing as that we just saw before, but we can actually go through multiple ones. In fact, it turns out, let's see how many there are. Turns out there's 11 of them. So you can actually go through and find specific classes that are containers, or you want a specific class that you're like, oh, this is important information. I can go through that part. Okay, cool. So again, that was kind of a really brief, like going through, just seeing what that looks like. Any questions on this? No? Okay. Thumbs up, sideways, thumbs down. How you feeling? Cool. All right. Again, more details on curriculum. I kind of want to show you guys one. For example, there was one I was doing a little project. Who's ever heard of the beer mile? No? Yeah, it's an interesting kind of race. It's a mile, but every lap you drink a beer. And so the rules are basically, it's that, well, you have to drink a beer every lap and you have to finish it through. And there's all these things. But what's kind of cool, this website here, Beer Mile, which I think started it off.
Beer Mile.
Oh, hi, Jonathan. What was that?
Beer Mile.
Oh, you keep cutting in and out. Your mic's going on crazy. Say it again.
It's
I just said, come on, guys, you've never done a beer mile.
I know. Yeah. So of course, our marathoner has done a beer mile. So
I have done a beer mile.
You might be on here then. That'd be kind of cool. So we can actually query this stuff. So for example, they already have a bunch of information. We can do a query. Let's see results. So I'm just going to put, I don't think it will pop up. Like, we'll just see what comes up. So you can see all these different races and stuff like that, number of participants. If I click on here, you can see all these different information. So this right here is a table if I didn't inspect element. So I actually wrote a little kind of play around with here to use beautiful soup. And you can actually use this to scrape that information and basically trying to find out those different parts. And what's interesting about this and what happens a lot of times is the data is not consistent. So at first it seems like, oh, cool. They have a name, a time, a gender, an age, a beer. So every time I get this part right here, I can just guess this URL. I played around this before, so I know that there's some certain URLs that work. But you can see here, this didn't have the same data that was here. So I have to say, okay, you'd have to make sure you get all this parts, but you'll notice that there's not actually this 100, there's not 151,000, it's something like 50,000 different pages. But basically figuring out how this is structured, going through it, and you might come across things like, oh, that doesn't quite work out. Like it's missing information, and you have to figure out how to store that and put that into your database. So I was just kind of showing you guys a kind of a quick, like, what that looks like. Okay, cool. All right, so that kind of sums up everything I wanted to talk about. Again, definitely check out the curriculum, right? I think that's a really good place to, what's it called? Like, it goes into a lot more detail, but honestly, a lot of it is, if you try Beautiful Soup, it's just to try it out. Take a website, try to scrape it for fun, see what you can get, especially a website that you're really familiar with, and seeing what kind of structures are there.